changed. So Dan, it's your turn to talk.
Great. Well, thank you. And what a great group of people to be discussing these incredibly important topics. My title is Historicizing Social Action. And it's a subject I've been interested in for a number of years, including, John, the collection on character that I don't think you had an essay in the volume, but we had a conference in North Carolina a number of years ago. I realized I was kind of thinking about these issues even then. But the line of argument, I'd just like to give you a sense of what is the line of argument. And the argument is that the Holocaust and the other horrendous evils and atrocities of the 20th century place in jeopardy our confidence in humanity, in who we are. The idea that human beings have a core nature that inclines us to living peacefully and compassionately together. It's hard to have any confidence in that idea following the details of the Holocaust, the Holodomor, the Gulag, and so forth. Jedwabne, Treblinka, Kolyma, these places and times demonstrate that we human beings must think differently and must act differently. We must live differently if we are to refrain from these horrors in the future, because we now understand that ordinary people and ordinary institutions did sustained evil. My line of thought is historicizing the idea of human nature, basically. My line of thought is that culture, moral frameworks, and visions of human life, these are all historical products. And that means that we are today the result of a long historical development with many episodes and changes of direction. But more importantly, who we are in 20 years and 50 years can be affected by the ways in which we confront the Holocaust and the horrors of the 20th century. If we honestly, soberly, and sorrowfully confront the Holocaust, we human beings can change our culture and the moral frameworks that we live by, because human beings are self-created. Collectively, not necessarily individually, but collectively, we can change our scripts. This is probably a familiar photograph to you. It's the photograph around which Wendy Lauer's book, The Ravine, is organized. And I choose it to begin this talk because it illustrates a number of the aspects of the Holocaust that seem most painful. The killing, to begin with, the fact that there are German soldiers, but there are also Ukrainian collaborators and militiamen, and there are several children being killed. So it has cruelty, it has the exercise of violence against the innocent, and it has the voluntary involvement of Ukrainian militiamen, probably OUN militiamen. We need to figure out as humanity how to ensure that scenes like this will not recur in the 21st century. And the very sad reality is scenes like this are recurring in Ukraine today. So this is not just an issue of history, it's an issue of our future. There are two views of human nature that philosophers have had in mind. Some philosophers have argued that there is an underlying permanent human nature, unchanging dispositions of behavior, and possibly unchanging moral truths. And philosophers like Kant and Vico probably exemplify this. But other philosophers like Herder or Nietzsche believe that social consciousness, the ways that we think about ourselves, our social identities, that these features are themselves historical products. I take the view of historicized humanity. Human beings have created human values through our history, and there is no other foundation for human values. I reread Paul's book, now republished in French, read it in English, but I'll read the French too, Paul. And one of the things which struck me is, of course, familiar to all of us, but the three standard theories which Paul highlights to explain the behavior of, quote, ordinary men doing horrific things in episodes like the one from Muropol that I began with. The situational view, which John Doris is kind of an advocate for, the structural view, and the intentional view. And Paul makes a case for the situational approach. My approach is a little bit different. I take an actor-centered approach to the analysis of historical events and the explanation of historical events. And the actor-centered approach actually requires that we consider all three of these features of structure, intention, and situation. In any given instance, the unfolding of an historical event surely involves aspects of each of these. In order to understand intentions, we need to have a thick understanding. This is an important point. We need to have a thick understanding of the actor and her historical development, how the actor became who she is, what her guiding mental frameworks are in terms of which she acts. To understand the situation in which the actor finds herself involves understanding the social and institutional relationships in which the actor exists, and understanding structure involves historical investigation of the largest factors influencing action, such as ideologies, bigotries, religious identities, all of which are conveyed, in the view that I take, conveyed through proximate influences. So what is this historicist theory of culture and identity which I'm advocating? Part of the thick theory of the actor, which I just mentioned, involves trying to reconstruct the mental framework of norms, values, and meanings in terms of which the actor understands the world in which he or she finds herself. Could someone admit Shmuel, please? Part of having a thick understanding allows us to try to reconstruct the mental framework of norms, values, and representations through which the individual understands her or his role in the world. And we need to understand that human beings act, in part anyway, in consideration of moral ideas and values, not necessarily driven and determined by one's moral ideas and values, but at least influenced by moral ideas and values. Ideas about how the individual, how I should behave towards other people. I am trying in this talk and elsewhere, trying to support the idea that the idea of humanity and human culture, this is a self-creation over time, an historical self-creation. There is no fixed and prior system of meanings, values, allegiances, and ways of acting that constitute humanity. Instead, human beings have, through our history of millennia of cultural formation, we have created frameworks of value, meaning, social relationships that have structured human communities and individual lives in different epochs, sometimes in very admirable ways and sometimes in very horrific ways. And it is certainly clear, I hope it's clear to all of us, that human communities have changed in our basic moral practices and commitments over the past several thousand years in very clear and kind of practical ways. It was once perfectly acceptable to torment animals for entertainment, but it no longer is. The Athenians believed it was permissible to kill prisoners of war, whereas this is now almost universally regarded as a war crime. This feature of human existence, the feature of the historicity of values and identity, gives rise to the crucial role played by historians and storytellers in the creation of culture and morality. Historians do not just tell the story, they contribute to our ability to frame an understanding of ourselves and how we want to exist in the world. Thucydides, for example, helped to create the Athenian moral framework through his painstaking historical narrative of the Peloponnesian War, but more exactly, he both expressed the Athenian worldview as it then existed and tested and extended it through his account of the experience of Athens in its prolonged war against Sparta. So this historicist understanding of culture and morality rejects several fundamentalisms. It rejects philosophical fundamentalism, the idea that human nature is fixed and unchanging. It rejects moral fundamentalism or foundationalism, the idea that there is just one permanent, unchanging set of moral principles binding on all people at all times. It rejects biological fundamentalism, the idea that human behavior is governed by a code created by our evolutionary history. Biology and evolution are certainly relevant to our normative capacities, but they are not, these features are not determinative. And finally, historicism rejects religious fundamentalism. It rejects the idea that there is a divine, unchanging, extra-human basis for human morality grounded in a set of sacred texts. So why is this important? You see 2 or 3 scary guys standing in front of the Michigan State House in March 2020 with semi-automatic weapons. That's why it's important, because we ourselves are actors in the creation of the moral culture of our own time. And the values that we care about, equality, democracy, compassion for others, anti-racism, these values are under serious and growing assault in the US, in Europe, in India, in other non-European countries. A set of civilizational values, widespread values rooted in hatred and violence is gaining a grip on our time. We are in a struggle for determining the culture which will be the culture of the 21st century. And it is crucial to exert ourselves in defense of liberal democracy, in defense of tolerance and acceptance across ethnicity and race and gender lines, and against the virulent strands of racism, violence, and hatred that are visibly increasing. Hate-based ideologies are gaining almost everywhere. We need to exert courage and activism in what we write, in organizations we support, in political parties, on social media, to dispute these appeals to the worst aspects of history. That's why an historicist understanding of our culture is really important. We can change our culture in more positive ways, and others are trying to do so in very negative ways. So is this a brand new idea? It is certainly not. Herder's historicism is one place where this idea of kind of an historicist view of culture and ethics or morality finds expression. Herder was historicist about human nature and human culture in particular. The logical implication of historicism is that human individuals become specific, culturally instantiated persons through their immersion in the culture of their time. A little bit analogous to the newborn baby who becomes either a German speaker or a Hindi speaker, depending on the speech communities to which she or he is born. This historicism cast doubt on all forms of essentialism about human nature and about the character of a people or a culture. Cultures and their value systems are contingent, and human individuals to whom they give rise are contingently different from their predecessors and successors. And again, I think this is a kind of an ordinary point, but even in US recent history, the last 100 years of history, generational differences are very evident, from the so-called greatest generation of World War II to the Vietnam War generation, my own generation, to the Generation Z. These generations have really very different moral and mental and cultural frameworks through which they process the world. To summarize, human beings create themselves through history, through action in history, by creating cultures, norms, and schemes of thinking. And this is a competitive process. Just one sentence from Herder, who probably wrote 2 million words. He was not a blogger, but nonetheless, he wrote a lot. Here's the one sentence I picked out for you. Thus, we everywhere find mankind possessing and exercising the right of forming themselves to a kind of humanity as soon as they have discerned it. And this is from Reflections on the Philosophy of the History of Mankind. Michael Forster is an excellent interpreter of Herder, and his gloss on this passage and others, Herder's most intrinsically important achievement, arguably, lies in his development of the thesis already mentioned, contradicting such Enlightenment philosopher historians as Hume and Voltaire, that there exist radical mental differences between different historical periods, that people's concepts, beliefs, values, sensations, and so on differ in deep ways from one period or culture to another. That is the essence of historicism. This view of human culture and identity has a radical implication for the possibility of change in humanity. Our histories change us, and we change the histories that we make. This is the reason why I find this topic to be a very important one in consideration of the Holocaust and the other horrors of the 20th century. Historians can help us change the way we think about the world, the way we think about institutions, and the institutions that we design by honestly confronting the realities of the Holocaust, the final solution, the Shoah. This historicism also implies a radical anti-essentialism about social identities. It implies there is nothing essential about being an Armenian, a Spaniard, a Buddhist, or a Jew. National cultural identities have a certain stability over time, which we can explain through very clear social mechanisms, but they also change over time. It's very different to be a Muslim in Los Angeles than a Muslim in Dearborn, Michigan. National and cultural identities are themselves historically located and historically malleable. I witnessed that change of Muslim identity in the 20 years I've lived in Dearborn by simply noticing the percentage of female Muslim students who now wear hijab. When I first came to UM Dearborn, very few Muslim female students wore hijab. Now a much greater percent do. That's cultural change. How about Nietzsche? I've just been talking about Herder, but Nietzsche also is an historicist about moral systems. His anti-moralism is a key theme of his philosophy and his civilizational criticism and his polemics. But what is clear when we strip away the polemics is that Nietzsche is historicizing human value systems through genealogy. He wants to understand the unsavory, or what he regards as the unsavory origins of traditional moral ideas. He looks at traditional European morality as herd morality, the consequence of Christian values of subordination and ressentiment. And it is very difficult to find positive or affirmative values which would allow us to criticize even the most grotesque examples of brutality and violence. Nietzsche is contemptuous of the values of kindness and compassion, which he regards as part of slave morality. But the key point is that human beings, in Nietzsche's appreciation, have created the value systems through history. We can ask an important question in reading Nietzsche. Does Nietzsche advocate for a particular moral system or value system? Is Nietzsche possibly an early theorist of Nazi philosophy? This is, of course, a disputed question among Nietzsche scholars, and I think most would say that he does not have a Nazi philosophy. But here is a really interesting line of interpretation of Nietzsche's relationship to political philosophy by Rolf Zimmermann. Zimmermann argues that Beyond Good and Evil is fundamentally a descriptive work, not a normative view about how we should live and orient our lives. It rests on the idea that moral ideas and value systems are contingent and historical. Nietzsche historicizes civilizational systems of values, and Zimmermann argues that Nietzsche's framework is compatible with both a liberal state and an authoritarian state. It all depends on what we human beings at a time in history, what we want. That is, what set of primary values about ourselves and our interactions with others that we have adopted as a people, as a nation, as a community, as a group. So Zimmermann's view is that the totalitarian ideologies of Hitler or Stalin are comprehensible in Nietzschean terms as the emergence of a new moral value framework following the demise of traditional European morality. but they are simply cultural historical products of a period in time, and they were subject to human contestation. The Hitlerites and the Stalinites, or Stalinists, prevailed at a time in history, but there was nothing inevitable about that, and it was not something that followed in any way from Nietzsche's own thinking. In particular, Zimmerman believes that it is consistent with Nietzsche's philosophical ideas to defend a liberal, egalitarian, and constitutional theory of the state along the lines, paradoxically enough, of John Stuart Mill in On Liberty. Crucially, we would have to, this is now quoting Zimmerman, we would have to speak of egalitarian universalism equally as an historical phenomenon. In short, as historical universalism, specifically related to the history of human rights theory in the 18th century. Or to put the point another way, real human beings and groups would have to struggle to secure and establish these values as foundations of their polities. I take you back to the photograph of the three armed men in front of the State House, literally threatening the liberal foundations of our government and our idea of a free society. We must struggle against those values or they will prevail. I want to take you back now 2,400 years in history to speak of Socrates, one of my own personal favorites, the stunfish, ugliest man in Athens, apparently. Ugly, I mean physically ugly, not personally ugly. And I want to talk about Socrates and war. Athenian conduct of war during the Peloponnesian War provides an important and interesting example of civilizational change. The Melian massacre involved the killing of all the men and the enslavement of women and children, a clear, from our point of view, clear atrocity. So there's the question of what is the status of Athenian acceptance of the atrocity of massacring innocent, unarmed men and enslaving women and children. But then there's the more specific point about Socrates. Socrates served, as I think all of us know, as an armored infantry soldier, a hoplite, during that war. And it is reasonable to ask whether Socrates would have carried out atrocious orders involving the execution of prisoners, the enslavement of women and children, and other acts of retaliation and punishment. Did Athenian morality, as embodied in its most famous moralist, tolerate massacre of the innocent? I think that's a really hard and important question. Ancient historian Mark Anderson offers a detailed and very interesting analysis of the known history, both of Athenian warfare during the Peloponnesian War and Socrates' own military history, which was probably 15 or 16 years of military service, and concludes that Socrates participated in some of the values that are documented to have involved atrocity and massacre, and that Socrates did not express moral opposition to these atrocious acts of war. So Anderson argues in detail that Socrates was a hoplite during exactly these kinds of campaigns of retaliation and atrocity, and that Socrates never expressed moral objection to them. This is not a direct dialogue between Anderson and Vlastos, but Gregory Vlastos, being probably the leading interpreter of ancient philosophy in the past 40 or 50 years, Vlastos takes a different view on the philosophy of war, the morality of war, and he holds that Socrates offered a, quote, moral revolution on war. The idea of a moral revolution is very consistent with the idea of an historicist understanding of values, because it implies a fundamental change of values. So Vlastos' view is supportive of the historicist approach that I'm advocating. He appears to hold that humanity creates its moral framework through the long human experiences of history. Values are created over time rather than discovered as timeless truths. One quote from Vlastos: Protagoras propounds a comprehensive theory of the origins of culture, which views all cultural institutions, including morality, as inventions through which men win the struggle for existence against wild beasts. Literally, human beings, men and women, create themselves through the struggle for existence and the struggle to create the communities in which they live. There are some really interesting discussions of the morality of war and the Athenian morality of war in the Republic in Book 5. But I'll just single out a couple of points. First is the distinction between waging war against other Greeks and against barbarians or non-Greeks. And there is secondly the question of the principle of moderation, first applied to acts of war against Greeks and then partially extended to non-Greeks. So there's the question, is waging war against Greeks different from waging war against barbarians? And secondly, are there limits on the conduct of war, including possibly limits on the use of massacre and enslavement and so forth? Vlastos's central idea, or central argument in the passages that I'm thinking of, is to show that Socrates rejected the Athenian moral idea, the kind of organizing Athenian idea of retaliation. The justification for massacre at Milos was retaliation against those who have wronged you. And Vlastos argues that Socrates rejects this moral framework. The traditional Athenian view of the moral acceptability of retaliation comes to bear in concrete detail when, as reported by Thucydides, the Athenian Assembly of Citizens is asked to consider the extermination of Mytilene for rebellion, which is exactly the fate that befell Milos several years later. But Vlastos argues that Socrates works very hard in the dialogue, works very hard to distinguish between punishment and revenge. Punishment is morally justified by the actions of the other, whereas revenge is motivated by hate and anger. But let's get back to the Greek versus non-Greek question. The only statement about war against non-Greeks is this, quote, "Our citizens ought to deal with their Greek opponents on this wise with moderation, while treating barbarians as Greeks now treat Greeks." But since Greek warfare against Greeks during the Peloponnesian War involved massacres of adult men, destruction of cities, enslavement of women and children, this passage appears to permit these practices against barbarians. Moreover, the sharp distinction that Socrates draws between fellow Greek and alien barbarian is ominous. It suggests that in war against barbarians, there are essentially no moral limitations, which begins to sound like a Nazi doctrine. We might say that the Athenian moral universe was fundamentally framed by a philosophical anthropology, a conception of humanity that we would today describe as xenophobic, racist, or imperialist. It was a worldview that systematically regarded other groups as subhuman, barbarians, the ones who babble, they are subhuman, and less worthy of moral consideration than one's own group. However, once barbarians are recognized as fully and equally human, the arguments given above for moderation in war between Greek adversaries would apply with equal force to war between Greek and non-Greek adversaries. So the moral step that needs to be taken is to recognize that barbarians are human just like Greeks. They live, they suffer, they experience, they have aspirations, and therefore they should be treated with the same moral consideration. Now I'm flipping forward to the 21st century again, and Susan Neiman, in her very interesting book, Evil in Modern Thought, really the role that the concept of evil has played in the history of philosophy. And there's just one idea from Susan Neiman that I'd like to present to you today. In this book, she introduces a key element of historicity of evil in her discussion of the concept of evil. Her treatment of Rousseau emphasizes Rousseau's view of the malleability of human nature. So Rousseau, by implication, is also a historicist. The malleability of human nature and emotions such as compassion. We can learn, we as a culture and we as an individual can learn to be compassionate. And Neiman holds that this is a crucial approach to Rousseau's consideration of the problem of evil in the world as well. Quoting from Neiman, for Rousseau, both the problem of evil and its solution depend on the idea that evil developed over time. This assumes in turn that human beings developed over time as species and individual beings. Entirely historicist. Human nature has been altered. For Rousseau, human nature itself has a history. Our choices affect it. This passage resonates with me very strongly because it really kind of captures exactly both the grounds of historicism and also the importance of historicism. We can change the future by recognizing our history and changing ourselves. Another passage, which I realize it's kind of long to read to you, but I think it's an important passage. History, this is from Neiman, history is the right kind of category to introduce because it enables us to understand the world and gives us hope for changing it. Gloss that, it gives us a basis for understanding the Holocaust and gives us hope for avoiding genocide in the future. History leaves space between necessity and accident, making actions intelligible without being determined. If the introduction of evil was necessary, then we can be saved only by a miracle. If evil is just an inherent part of the world, then we can't be saved from evil. If it was an accident, then the world, where it matters, makes no sense. History, by contrast, is dynamic. I would put it, history is made by situated social actors. If evil was introduced into the world, then it might also be eradicated, as long as its development is not fundamentally mysterious. After Rousseau, we need not deny the reality of evil. We can rather incorporate it into a world whose intelligibility is expanding. Exploring evil as historical phenomena becomes part of our efforts to make the world more comprehensible in theory and more acceptable in practice. Going back to that photograph of the Ukrainian killing pit in Mariupol, to make that scene not occur again, both understanding how it could have happened and understanding what needs to be changed in order to not allow it to recur. These ideas from Neiman are suggestive for the question of how to confront the historical experience of evil, because they point to the fundamental malleability of human culture and morality. Human nature and history are reciprocally intertwined, and this in turn suggests the possibility of a kind of self-positing and learning from history that seems most relevant to the approach to evil that I want to take when it comes to bringing historical understanding into conversation with extreme evil and the atrocities of the 20th century. The photograph is the mournful aftermath of the pogrom in Kielce, Poland, in 1946. In other words, after the end of World War II, after the final solution, a horrific pogrom and killing of Jews in the village of, or the town of Kielce occurred. So never again lasted about 12 months. I have one final point I want to make, and then I'll close. I've been talking about the fact that culture and human morality and human ways of understanding each other, that culture can be changed. But I would now like to emphasize that culture change is not enough to prevent atrocity, evil, and Holocaust. Can human civilization become more compassionate and less prone to murder and other atrocity? Yes, I think so. Like the ancient Greeks, we can come to more deeply recognize the humanity of the other without the veil of racism and xenophobia. That's kind of what we saw in the case of Socrates and the Greeks, but we also see it in American history in the changes in racial attitudes since 1956 to the present through the civil rights struggle. We see a change of mental framework in thinking about relations between Black people and white people and brown people in the United States. That process is only underway. It is by no means complete. we can more deeply embody the values we choose of compassion and fairness. But this is not sufficient to make genocide and atrocity impossible in the future. Institutions and states are critical to the occurrence of evil and atrocity in the 20th century, and they will be critical in the future. One of the most important lessons we learn from studying the Holocaust and the Holodomor and other examples of massive sustained evil is the role of states, militaries, secret police systems, and bureaucracies in projecting evil. State organizations permitted Hitler and Stalin to act, and smashed states, the phrase from Snyder, permitted their actions to be appallingly successful. Quoting from Timothy Snyder, this calamity, the final solution, cannot be explained by stereotypes of passive or communist Jews, of orderly or pre-programmed Germans, of beastly or anti-Semitic locals, or indeed by any other cliche, no matter how powerful at the time, no matter how convenient today. This unprecedented mass murder would have been impossible without a special kind of politics. And what are those politics? Well, in Ukraine, killing by Ansatzgruppen commandos, Ukrainian nationalist militias, and local people went forward rapidly and without any effective opposition. The Jews of Lvov, Kiev, and Berdichev were without defense. They were killed methodically and in vast numbers. By contrast, the Nazi occupation in Denmark failed utterly, failed completely, because of the persistence of Danish political institutions, even under occupation. According to the data that I pulled up for the talk, only 100 of about 10,000 Danish Jews lost their lives. And Timothy Snyder's explanation of that fact is, I'm just going to read the middle part of this passage. The Nazi administrators, beginning in the middle of the paragraph, confronted in Copenhagen with institutions that had been abolished further east, a sovereign state, political parties with convictions and support, local civil society in various forms, a police force that could not be expected to cooperate. That is the political setting in which Holocaust, atrocity, and mass killing is most unlikely to occur. And on that, that cautionary note, let's pay attention when armed men come to your state house. It's a very bad sign. Okay, thanks.
So, many thanks for your talk. So yeah, many thanks, Dan. So I had like a question regarding your take on the debate between Browning and Goldhagen, because I have the impression that you're on the side of Goldhagen, since you think that's actually it's the culture that explains evil behavior.
No, I have a more specific objection to Goldhagen, and that is that I think his book was, early 2000s, late 1990s.
1996.
Yeah, the amount of knowledge available about European collaborators, possibly that information, that data, that evidence was just not available to Goldhagen. But the realities in Ukraine, Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, I think just refute the Goldhagen hypothesis. Because the OUN, the Ukrainian nationalist militia, was just as Nazi, just as fascist, just as willing to, well, not just willing, eager to kill Jews, to kill Poles. This was not a uniquely German initiative. So that would be my, in other words, I think it's way more complex. I think that Goldhagen is really offering, kind of a single dimensional hypothesis about a historical outcome, which Snyder is so much better at explaining, which is multiple causal processes, multiple institutional realities, multiple forms of agency. Goldhagen boils it all down to a very unique German anti-Semitism, which I think just doesn't stand up. It's not that the anti-Semitism didn't exist, but it's not sufficient to explain the Holocaust.
Thank you. So I think John and Carsten have a question, but I don't know in which order, so I will just follow my screen. John, you have a...
Okay. So I am enjoyed that a lot, and I'm mostly on board with what your historicism, which I'd call sort of a thesis of radical cultural contingency. But I think I'm also a biological fundamentalist on your view. So I'd want to keep fundamentalist. So here are a couple of, as a biological fundamentalist, I think human beings are ultra-social or eusocial organisms. They inevitably are found in affiliations, and those affiliations are everywhere associated with in-group, out-group distinctions. And then I'm a little more tentative on hierarchical organizations. But if we just stick to affiliating organizations who inevitably hive off into in and out groups, right? Maybe we look at the minimal groups literature and so on and so forth. And then I've got to make a bet. So should I bet on atrocity being found wherever we find warfare, or atrocity being highly contingent, right? I want to say it's not so contingent as a biological fundamentalist. So very true that, say, take Abu Ghraib, and things are gonna go bad if you have a bunch of 20-year-old convenience store clerks from West Virginia with no experience and training in handling prisoners, right? So that's the contingency. So there's going to be contingency in forms of the disaster. But should we expect atrocity wherever we find warfare? That's a deep biological fact.
So it's a really complicated question you're asking, John. And it's one that I've thought about quite a bit. In terms of the sociobiology kind of view that we can account for, most fundamental forms of human behavior in terms of biological history. The person whose work I like the best is Alan Gibbard, and his book, Wise Choices, Wise Feelings, Apt Choices.
I always mix that up too, yeah. I think it's Wise Choices, Apt Feelings.
But he gets, I think he gets it just about right, that there is, of course, an evolutionary history to humans as primates. And we're a very different organism than goldfish or other kinds of even advanced organisms. So we have an evolutionary history. But what Gibbard argues is that what our evolutionary history gifted us with was a very flexible platform for involving culture, for involving an ability to evolve norms and patterns and ways of behaving with each other, which actually constrain the war of all against all, the kind of Hobbesian picture of social Darwinism, going back to the early part of the 20th century or late 19th century, that it's all about competition and aggression. What Gibbard is arguing is that the human evolutionary history is one which gifted us with an ability, to cooperate. So we do have the kind of social, emotional infrastructure necessary to be able to cooperate in small groups. But then secondly, we have an ability to formulate and then to some extent live by sets of social norms which permit social cooperation. When you mentioned Abu Ghraib, that actually relates to my last slide about institutions and social arrangements. If it were what's it called? The Island of the Flies? Lord of the Flies. If it's just the Lord of the Flies, or it's just the prison scenario of Zimbardo, just take a bunch of stupid American teenagers and stick them in a difficult situation and see if they kill each other. Well, that's a non-institutionalized setting. Who can we blame for military justice and military arrangements for handling prisoners? I wouldn't blame the 20-year-old stock clerk who wound up being a prison guard. I would blame military discipline, military institutional arrangements, which made it possible to commit those kinds of atrocities, those kinds of humiliation and degradation against harmless, at this point, disarmed, non-armed, non-combatant persons. In other words, it kind of underlines the point that Snyder is making, that institutional arrangements are what are needed in order to prevent, whether it's sending Einsatzgruppen to Kiev and killing 40,000 Jews on day one, or soliciting Ukrainian nationalists to do pretty much the same in Berdichev. What would prevent that? Well, what would prevent it is having effective interlocking political institutions. It might be military discipline, or it might be, in the case of Denmark, it might be a king, an armed forces, a navy, a merchant marine, a police force, all of whom had their own kind of organizing normative commitments. That's why I say it's a struggle. It's why it's necessary for us as a civilization to struggle, because those goons whose picture I gave you in front of the Michigan State House, 3 of them, I mean, not the 3 that I photographed, but 3 of them were eventually implicated in the plot to kidnap and kill the governor of the state of Michigan. That is horrific and horrendous. And their willingness to do it, I can't account for it. I kind of like to understand it. But what prevented them from doing it was the institution of FBI informants and FBI law enforcement, and a willingness to prosecute and not to wink and say, well, white supremacists, that's not too dangerous, and so forth.
Yeah, go ahead, Karsten.
Thanks, Dan. That was great. I actually think you're a closet moral foundationalist, and you have to be. And I think actually, look, I think you underestimate the hooligans in the Michigan State House. And the reason why I say it, actually, the right is very good at telling their stories. And if it's just storytelling and contingency of the storytelling, I think we need to have a dimension in which we distinguish between right and wrong stories. So the Nazis were extremely powerful in telling their stories. Mm-hmm. They had a whole ideology, they had a whole story about why the Germans had to do what the Germans had to do. At least exclusion of Jews was very much part of that story. And it seems to have been a very much accepted story within that German context. And so I actually think you underestimate the danger of the right in believing in your story. But the story that the right is telling is a very powerful one. And it seems to resonate with a lot of people, and they do understand the power of story, because they make sure that you are not allowed to tell your stories in the schools anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I'm a little wondering whether we don't need to be a bit more philosophical about justifying the perspective from which we tell this kind of liberal story and talk about freedom and the right conception of freedom, because the right is certainly having a conception of freedom. So I'm a little bit worrying about, if it's just the contingency of the stories, then you give the right everything that they want. And I believe a little bit, we need a little bit more of a Kantian perspective.
So my quick answer is yes, we need to argue with the right. We need to persuade people. We need to have compelling stories about equality and compassion and caring. So yes, all of that. I teach a seminar called Democracy and the Politics of Hate, and it scares me profoundly that exactly what you say, the power of the right and the stories that they tell. I don't see any alternative except progressive people coming together, forming progressive organizations, talking with their neighbors, and making the case for, I don't know, liberal isn't even the right word to introduce because it's so coded in American politics anyway. But that we need, of course, to tell our own story and to tell it in a way which is compelling to other people. The only thing I disagree with you about is the idea that, well, maybe there's a bedrock we can get back to, whether it's Locke or Kant or Aristotle. And that's how we can compel the right to give up their anti-Semitic lies. No, we won't be able to do that. Because they're not that open to rational philosophical argument, but B, it's kind of a charade. Kantianism is a charade. It claims a priori certainty for philosophical ethics, but it can't deliver. So I'm more of a Rawlsian, more of a kind of pragmatist when it comes to philosophical justification. There's certain things that you and I and maybe a somewhat moderate conservative might agree about, like it's better if neighbors don't kill each other suddenly in the night. And what follows from that? What can we, what can we build upon from that? It is kind of bootstrapping. I think that's all we can do is bootstrap, make the best case we can for our values of equality. I was leader of a university for a very long time, 18 years. And I spent a lot of that time working on inclusion and multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multiracial acceptance and respect on our campus. And I can tell you that in a real microcosm, it's tiny, but it was very possible to change the climate, the culture on our campus in a way which led people from being hostile and suspicious, whether it's white students suspicious of Black students or Black students suspicious of Muslim students. We were able to dissolve that through just some really good, honest talking together. And I guess I see that as partly, it wasn't mathematics, it was talking and building consensus where there hadn't been one before.
I like Adam Smith in that respect, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Looks like Paul's got his hand up.
Yeah, but it's great.
Stephen too.
Stephen, if you wanted to answer, I've already had a chance to speak. If you wanted to go ahead, I'm happy to defer.
I hate to have you defer, but here I do have a question. It's about this whole question of a bedrock. And just to begin with, very brief comment about both Herder and Nietzsche. It seems to me both of them are more complicated than you said. Of course, you're only speaking briefly, but I mean, Herder was a child of the Enlightenment. And Herder he did have this view about deep cultural diversity, but he also believed that all moral systems shared some version of the golden rule. And he thought that there was in process a convergence towards Enlightenment values. So, and with Nietzsche too, I think Nietzsche was, of course, was a moralist. That's to say, he had this historicizing view, but there's also a strong moralizing streak in Nietzsche too. But enough about them. My question to you is really this, Dan. I've been thinking a lot about just all these questions that you're talking about, but it strikes me that your view is a kind of extreme one, which lacks the nuance of both Herder and Nietzsche, in the sense that it seems to me that for you, if we ask the question, are there any limits to moral diversity? not the question, are there any limits to what human beings can do, but are there any limits to the moralities that can prevail in different societies? Or to put that question in another way, how wide and how deep does moral diversity, understood that way, go? And it seems to me your answer is there are none. That morality can take any conceivable, any possible form. There's no reason to think that any limits. And as for depth, similarly, there's no way of ever resolving moral disputes that doesn't, in the end, amount to some kind of that can't consist in persuasion or argument. So I think your answer to the question, how deep and how wide does moral diversity go, is that there are no limits. And I suppose my question is, if that's not true, in other words, if there are limits, where would they come from? And your anti-fundamentalisms, all your various oppositions to fundamentalism and bedrocks, seem to me to say there's no answer, there's no way of setting such limits other than, well, on the one hand, some sort of belief in collective voluntarism, that somehow human beings are going to collectively get better, or Tim Snyder, the idea of institutional solutions, which are of course always going to be specific and local. So it's not as though I have an answer to these deep questions you raised, but that's what I want to ask you, really. Are you saying there are no limits to moral diversity?
So here's kind of thank you, Stephen. Those are really deep questions. One kind of answer that people have tried out, which you know better than I do, is social contract theorizing. Try to kind of boil things down to what does a social community require at its most basic? That people don't kill their neighbors, and that people respect each other's property, and they don't steal their children. And in other words, there's a very basic list of requirements of peace and order, which Hobbes and Locke and maybe Rousseau advocated. But the reality is, my neighbors who carry guns don't accept those premises. They say, no, I should be in a position to dominate you. So no, I don't accept that principle that we should all subordinate ourselves to one social order. No, I want to kill you, man, because you're white, or you're brown, or you're black, or you're Jewish, you're homosexual, you're the Antichrist, you're liberal, you're atheist, you're all these bad things. I'm not all of those things at once, but hate is not something that Hobbes can refute. And so what's the alternative? Well, one alternative is you wind up with a Nazi 1,000-year hate-based polity. It could have happened. Another possibility is that enough of us as human beings, I don't know, is loving your children culturally specific? I don't know. In some way, I guess you might say that different cultures have different ways of expressing love for their children. But maybe some of these basic ideas about human compassion, human caring about the other person. How could, in that original shooting, in the pit in Mariupol that I showed you, how could a Ukrainian man take his rifle and shoot a woman, her son, and what Wendy Lauer shows is there's another even smaller child wrapped up in the woman's skirt. How could he possibly do that while also recognizing that this is a child, just like the child you may have in your own home? So you might think, I think this is kind of a Martha Nussbaum way of responding, by expanding the individual's sphere of vision, maybe through literature, maybe through talking with people who are brown or gay or lesbian or, atheist or whatever, and coming to see human being just like me. Therefore, pay some attention to his or her moral importance. Maybe there's something basic. I don't know, John, whether it makes any sense to say something basic in social psychology that leaves us open to that opening. But if a little bit of caring for other people's suffering and little caring about fairness, if those are, oh, I hate to call them natural, but if they are impulses that we are vulnerable to, then you can build a lot about social harmony on that basis.
Many thanks, Dan. So thank you again, Clip.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and let's take a 5-minute break. In 5 minutes, so and then we come back to listen to Isabel.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to translate, and the title actually was inspired by Raphael, who wanted me to talk about my peculiar approach of those issues. So I could say it's philosophy from above or from below. So I would like to thank Raphael for inciting me to approach those issues from a philosophical perspective. And I have to say, I did not expect to have so many philosophers in the audience. I thought there would be mainly historians, and I feel a little bit embarrassed and impressed, because I prepared something which was, philosophy for dummies, and instead of that, there is Paul, there is Stephen, so it's a little bit unsettling. I wanted to start by the attraction and limits of philosophy in this realm of the understanding or explanation of mass crimes, and with the fact that philosophy has both relevance, but in a limited way. I would like to focus, to underline, and the main point is philosophy to have something relevant to say in this realm as to fight, I think, two philosophical tendencies. The one is the tendency to generalize and look for general definition and theories, and so look for general approach of genocide, whether it is structure, eliminative intention, radicalization, or situation, and the tendency to be an asylum of ignorance or incomprehension. In the ethics, Spinoza makes fun of the superstitious people who is always looking for the last reason of things and the last causes, and who end up claiming it's God's will. And in a certain domain, we find that the last because is treated, the last word in the last because is granted to philosophers who are in charge of giving the meaning of what seems to be impossible to understand. That was this has been the case. I mean, maybe less in the States, but in France and in continental philosophy, this has been the case very much of Arendt's approach of the banality of evil, where it was used as the last explanation. And in the end, people would say, well, that's a banality of evil. And we even find that this attraction of philosophy has been used by clever minds, where you see Browning quoting Milgram and then Arendt, and then you have like a series, Browning, Milgram, Arendt, all pointing to the same thing, and in the end, it's the banality of evil. There are many drawbacks in this approach, and these two philosophical tendencies are, I think, useless and counterproductive to address the issue of mass crimes. You might, I mean, if we were not among philosophers, we would say, well, who cares about philosophy, and let's go, you know, to real business and, you know, art science, psychology, or history. But we find that those tendencies emerge also in social sciences, not only in philosophy, and that the anesthesia of philosophy, or what we are looking for in philosophy, is not so easy to escape, since you find that historians also use those explanations, or social scientists like Browning already quote, even if it's really short, also Zygmunt Bauman and Enzo Traverso and others. So the type of approach I would defend in philosophy would be closer to first a Wittgensteinian approach, where Wittgenstein was saying it's more important to understand the difference between type of numbers than to have a general definition of numbers. And I would say it's more important to be able to approach the difference between Auschwitz and Sobibor, or between Babi Yar and Srebrenica, rather than to have an approach of genocide in general. And I would also defend an approach which could be close to Quine naturalized epistemology, rather than it would be socialized epistemology, that is being in the boat of human sciences to change the planks little by little and progressively from the inside, without being able to have an outside look or a view from nowhere. And why is it important to have this approach? It's because a certain differentiation between situations, genocides, and cases cannot be done only in conceptual terms, at least not in certain conceptual terms, which are those of moral philosophy. Well, in those matters, most of us would grant that the greatest part of the job of understanding what happened during the Holocaust in Germany was mainly brought by historians rather than philosophers. So what is the last realm of philosophy where philosophers can have something relevant to say? Most of the time, as compared to social sciences, it's the realm of morals and norms. Well, in this realm, facing mass crimes, we don't have much to say as philosophers, and there are good reasons for that. It's because genocide are morally unthinkable. And what I mean by that is that there is no serious discussion in philosophy, at least in our academic circles, about whether or not we should commit genocide. And but it's not only in our academic circles, it's that genocides are not justified, and for those who try to justify them, they never do it directly. They try to minimize them. So as Vidal-Naquet, a famous historian in France, was saying, negationism has replaced a moral skepticism. Mass crimes are not justified, they are minimized, and the question of how many, are you sure that so many people were killed, has become the modern version of, is it really so bad? So the negationism has taken the part of moral skepticism or relativism. And the second limit of moral discourse is the absence of possible differentiation. the moral discourse is roughly the same to qualify the genocide in Germany or in Rwanda. And we will say it's atrocious, inhumane, monstrous, unthinkable, not possible to justify, absolute evil. But we didn't have much more to say except going in the social sciences and using their vocabulary to make specific differences. And we have there not only a moral limit, but a logical limit. We cannot express in moral terms we cannot wonder or ask if it's better to have been the commander of Dachau or Sobibor, if it's better to have been Eichmann or Eus, or if it's better to have committed genocide in Rwanda or in Cambodia, to have participated in the massacre in Babi Yar or in Rwanda. So there is a real limit and poverty of moral philosophy. We can add up blame on blame, but cannot go in a differentiated, relevant discourse about those genocide, the motivation of their agents, and the dire straits of the and misery of the victims. But nonetheless, even if moral philosophy cannot do it, we need to do it. We need to be able to say that Theresienstadt was not Auschwitz, that Srebrenica was not Rwanda, and that it was not the Khmer genocide either. And so in facing this, that what is for us morally unthinkable, we have to move on the side and go in the boat of the social sciences, using the work of historians, because it is historians who are able to address the issue of the morality of the genociders. It is Hilbert or Yuan Chaput who were able to actually articulate what could be the morals of the German bureaucrats or ordinary Germans. And these displacements mean that we have to go, we have to consider issues of knowledge, truth, historical truth, and also address the issue of the morality of the genociders, the perpetrators, but used not as our possible morality, but at the study of the morality of others, their justification, either during war or genocide times, or in court after the war when there was a judgment. And so this has led me to to go in and do social sciences, work with social scientists, or myself do social scientist work in two main directions. One is doing field work in Bosnia after the war, where I interviewed victim association, people who testified in the Hague Tribunal, the International Tribunal for a criminal tribunal for former Yugoslavia, witnesses for defense and for prosecution, and the few convicted criminals who came back from the Hague and who came back to live in Priedo. So most of those interviews were in Priedo and area. And also a study of the investigations and reports on Srebrenica massacre. That was part of my work. And another one is using this material to shed new light on the Eichmann trial, and that was based mainly on archive and a type of sources which have been really not so much used, and I will explain what it is. I could say that part of my work has been to address fake, unfounded generalization and the transportation of arguments from one context to another. Let me check. What time did I start, Raphaël? On t'entend pas.
Around 7 or 7:08.
Non, mais 7 quoi?
4:07.
J'ai quoi?
4h07.
D'accord. Okay. So the study I tried to work on the Eichmann trial, and I will first start with this study on the Eichmann trial because it shows the limits of philosophy and nonetheless how philosophers can be useful, mainly to fight against other philosophers. There have been a lot of criticisms concerning Arendt's account from historians, very good criticism from Raoul Hilbert, from Cesarani, from Chapoutot. I entirely agree with critics of Paul in this Heart of Darkness. And we showed that it was empirically false, and that most of that mainly her vision of Eichmann was the projection of her previous conceptions of totalitarian system and the totalitarian man. That was done. The second thing I showed, what I showed a little bit more precisely, is that I was in better position to